This is EV News Daily with another Saturday special, and people love it when we take a break at the weekend from the news. It'll be back tomorrow to do a deep dive into one of the industries around electric cars, and perhaps the biggest thing, apart from buying the car, is where you charge your car. And I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Jonathan Levy. He is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at EVgo. They are America's largest public electric vehicle charging network, over 1,000 chargers, 66 metropolitan markets, and hopefully we can get some insights into, for people listening all around the world, the American market, and generally pick his brains on EV charging. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Martin. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you hitting the top lines on EVgo so I don't have to sound like an advertisement at the beginning.
That's okay. Consider it all part of the service. Hey, can I ask you though, too, it's a cheeky question from a Brit over here. What is a Vice President of Strategic Initiatives?
It's a title that's a catch-all, in all frankness. I think it's one of those things where this is a growing company. We have the largest public fast-charging network in the U.S., but we have a lot of work to do, and we've grown rapidly in not just number of chargers, but number of employees. And in that time period, there's a lot to get done. So my day-to-day can vary from working directly with our automaker partners and new stakeholders in a business development role. It can be much more of the broader strategy of thinking about what's happening next in the market and where we need to go from partnerships, but also on the technology side. And it can also be a little bit of the proverbial what's what. Sometimes I'm working on things in the policy arena. Sometimes it's working with folks like you and getting our name and message out there. So it's a bit of a catch-all and something where hopefully it just means that I'm not just a jack of all trades and a master of none, but somebody that can be part of a great team here and be filling in and leading where I need to.
You haven't been there so long that I can still get away with saying congratulations on joining EVgo. Are you still relatively one of the new boys, or are your feet under the table by now? Congratulations, I'll say it anyway, for joining.
Yeah, thank you. It's always welcome to be congratulated, regardless of the context. I've officially been on board only since May, but I've been involved with the company for over 2 years, having come over to EVgo from Vision Ridge Partners, which is the investment firm that has the controlling stake in EVgo. So I've been around the company and the ecosystem for a while, but only officially on board since May.
The big question first, and then we'll work our way backwards and get into the granular detail. Why aren't more people driving electric cars in August 2018, in your opinion?
So it's a great question because the adoption in the U.S. has been fantastic in terms of growth, but in terms of absolute value, it's still a low percentage of the overall fleet. And some of that is a combination of factors, but one of the biggest ones is model availability. And in the United States, the automakers have taken a kind of segmented approach to certain markets, and there are more electric vehicle models available in California by a wide swath than any other state. And that's one of the many reasons California accounts for about half of the EVs sold in the U.S. I think what you're starting to see between increased range and lower cost vehicles like the new Nissan Leaf and the Chevy Bolt and obviously the Tesla Model 3, you're starting to see more ubiquitous interest, as well as that signal to the automakers that this isn't just a niche compliance car. And so you're starting to hear them talk about targeting the New England space and other markets in a way that means that model availability will flow to new markets. California does some really interesting consumer research surveys, and one of them shows that more than 50% of Californians can't even name a single model of electric vehicle, and just saying Tesla would count. The number one indicator of willingness to consider an EV is awareness, and awareness of knowing somebody that has one. So some of it is really just breaking through that initial gauze of people that don't know that electric vehicles are an option for them because either they don't see them at the dealer or they don't know that it's an electric vehicle on the road. And so once we can get over that barrier, as you know, electric vehicles are just a better way to drive. And once we get people to put butts in seats or see their neighbors really enjoying their BMW i3 or their Chevy Bolt, they suddenly want one too. Speaking from experience, I drive a Nissan Rogue. I've had it for a while. I love it. My friends at Nissan want me to buy a new car because I paid it off, but I am a little bit reticent to do so. But when I drive a Nissan Leaf for a change because it's helpful, I really enjoy driving it in a way that sometimes it makes me miss the acceleration of the EV when I switch back to my ICE vehicle. I think that's a trend that we're starting to see where more people get in, they see it, whether it's being in their friend's car or at a ride and drive or something else, or the biggest thing that's happening now, one of the biggest things that's happening now is the increase of electric vehicles in rideshare like Uber and Lyft. Suddenly people start talking to their driver about it, they get more interested. I think it's a very positive trend that's going to change, and you'll see that growth of EVs sold in the U.S. continue to proliferate and grow very quickly. But additionally, we're going to have to start thinking more about vehicle miles traveled and not just volume sold of cars. As more and more Americans decide to eschew personal vehicle ownership, Uber, Lyft, and other TNC companies putting the more vehicle miles traveled on the road, they become that much more important from a performance, the benefit to total cost of ownership, which is, are lower in EVs, as well as the environmental footprint. That really becomes where the growth is key to watch, and as well as on the charging side, because EV drivers that are rideshare drivers can charge 5 to 7 times as much as a personally owned vehicle would.
You mentioned about miles driven. It was one of the things that caught my eye when your PR team connected with me last year just to send me a press release, and it was all about how EVgo had got to 40 million miles of emissions-free electric driving. It flicked a switch in my brain at the time because I was always looking for those stats, those vanity metrics of how many customers, how many cars, how many chargers, what's the charging speed, and that kind of the guy stuff and stats and ranking. And then when it was put in terms of miles traveled. Thank you very much to you guys for enlightening me a few months ago when I got that press release.
If I could jump in on the miles part too, I think that's actually one of the key reasons why fast charging is so important. Because if you just look at number of sessions and you're just conflating all charging, suddenly it's less impressive in some ways and more in others. But when you get 7 times the charge on a DC fast charger that you do on a level 2 charger, you have to think about, wow, one session on a DCFC was worth a lot more than that one on the L2 in terms of what it means for the customer and the ability to drive.
So for anyone not listening in North America that doesn't know EVgo, but maybe has a local charging company where they're listening around the world, what's your business model?
Yeah, so we are primarily focused on utilization. That's one of the reasons we care so deeply about the delivery of the kWh to our customers to see how far they can drive, because we make money when they're using the chargers. I think in some markets, we've seen some really good uptake, and the penetration of electric vehicles is significant in a way that we can be having a good business in those markets. There are other markets where EV adoption is still low enough that path to profitability is still a path rather than a present, and that's where partnerships are really important. We've worked really closely in the past, not just with policymakers, but also with automakers and other stakeholders. So for example, in the US, if you buy a new Nissan Leaf or a BMW i3 in markets where EVgo is, there's a relationship between the automaker and EVgo where the automaker will provide you 2 years of free charging on our network. Additionally, we have worked with policymakers in other markets, including, for example, just last week, the Commonwealth of Virginia awarded EVgo its first Appendix D settlement money, which we can talk about if you'd like, but it's a $14 million partnership for EVgo to build fast charging and other charging out across the state of Virginia. What we see is the key is utilization. Getting drivers to charge is what the most important part of an asset-backed business like EVgo is, but there are opportunities to have additional revenue streams through partnerships, as well as looking ahead to where things are going with some dedicated charging. We have a relatively new partnership with GM's Maven Gig program, where that's a program where on the EV side, GM does short-term rentals to drivers that want to participate in the gig economy like Uber and Lyft again, by giving them and renting them a Chevy Bolt, for example, with insurance and the charging wrapped in. And we have right now, that partnership is having those drivers use both the public EVgo chargers as well as we're underway with constructing dedicated Maven chargers for them. So there's a number of different streams there, but it all comes down to utilization is really critical in an asset-based business to make it work.
So if it comes down to speed, then where do you stand on the debate? I see both sides of the argument online. In terms of the battery sizes in EVs, we're seeing a new slew of EVs coming out very soon. Hyundai Kona, the Niro EV that will have up to the long range of 64 kilowatt-hour batteries. Of course, the Teslas are larger, the expensive SUVs that are coming, the Audis, the Mercedes, the Jaguar I-Paces, anything from 70 to 95 kilowatt-hour batteries. The pace of technology changing. A lot of people are obsessed with carrying as much energy around with them as possible. I always point out to them, but then you're carrying weight around with you, which in EV is a direct penalty. Is there like a perfect battery size in your mind?
I think it comes down to a combination of factors. Right now, consumers still have the dreaded range anxiety, and in part that's because of the limitation of the battery range, but in part it's because of the lack of awareness and the not yet ubiquitous presence of charging. And I think you have the interplay there. In the psychological surveys, you see people need to see 200 miles of range, and really they would like to have 300 plus. But do you really need to get to a point where it's 400 or 500? or is the 200, 300 range sufficient when you have confidence in the charging infrastructure? I think that's a really interesting point because as battery costs have come down and lightweighting has improved and other things, we've been able to do more and more. But you're right that at some point, just putting in more battery for more range is defeating from a weight perspective when charging can take that place at regular intervals. But that has all sorts of issues for a slightly more advanced market than where we are today in the U.S. So I think for right now, the biggest thing is building out the charging infrastructure in partnership with automakers, in partnership with others, so that we can sell the electric vehicles that even make this a good problem to have. And that's what EVgo is focused on, not just staying happy with 1,000 fast chargers, but really growing aggressively and doing so in a way that any customer can have confidence. Our CEO, Kathy Zoy, often talks about the fact that our biggest mission is to make sure there are no barriers to electric vehicle adoption in the U.S., and that starts with public fast charging infrastructure.
Where do your DC fast chargers mainly go? Is it your commercial partners? Are they shopping centers, or is it mixed?
Yeah, it is mixed. Part of the advantage of electric vehicles is the fact that you have more flexibility. You don't have to just go to the equivalent of a petrol station and sit there. You can integrate it into your daily life. So a lot of our fast chargers are in grocery store parking lots or in malls or in strip malls that are off the highway or sometimes in the urban core. We actually think there's a much better business in the urban and suburban markets because that's where most driving is happening and therefore most usage of the stations will be happening. So for example, we have over 100 fast chargers at Walmarts. We have great partnerships with Whole Foods and other grocery stores like that. There's also a series of property owners in the U.S. that we've worked with. So as you point out, you can just go do what you were going to do anyway, which is your weekly shopping, your weekly grocery shopping, or perhaps going to buy a present for someone's birthday, and you plug in your car, you swipe once on the EVgo app, you go do what you were going to do anyway, and the car and the charger do the work. So when you come back, you have 80% or so of your charge and can move about the rest of your day and week. There are some instances, obviously, where you're going to want more dedicated charging plaza type activities. And so we're going to be doing some of that, in particular with the state of Virginia, but also in other places, because for road trips, it becomes more important. But even then, I took a little road trip with a Nissan Leaf where I went from Los Angeles to Palm Springs to San Diego and back. And it's not a huge distance, but any time that my partner and I stopped, we would just pop off and go get lunch while the car was charging, or even go to Trader Joe's and load up for where we were going for the Airbnb next. And that was a lot preferable to just sitting at a gas station equivalent because it was a nice way to still take advantage of our time and enjoy our road trip.
Let's talk about charge speeds. I'm always getting comments from listeners going, oh, when are we going to get 100 kilowatt, 150, 350 kilowatt charging? Here in Europe, we've got things like the Ionity network and Fastned, and they are just going on the pure headline of, look how fast you can charge your car. So there's the speed issue that I'd love to explore with you. The other thing that I always call it chicken and egg, and then recently on a Clean Technica thing, I heard you call it something else. Can you tell us about what you say instead of chicken and egg?
Yeah, so on the speed front, we fully agree in that EVgo thinks the speed needs to match the use case. So in that Whole Foods example, a 350 kilowatt charger is not actually convenient for you because you don't have to go move your car before you finish in the produce aisle. And it's not necessarily good for that Whole Foods who wants you there for at least 15, 20 minutes. But on the highway, you might need that. And what EVgo is doing in a lot of places is deploying a 50 or an 80 kilowatt charger, but wiring it for 150 so that we can upgrade it. As you know, the cars can't take it anyway, although the new ones will be able to take higher and higher. And so being positioned in that market is important. That ties to the metaphor, which I can't take full credit for. There's an organization in the U.S. up in the Pacific Northwest called Fourth Mobility, and their executive director, Jeff Allen, talks about instead of chicken and egg, it's the hot dog and the bun. In the States, at least, there's this frustrating phenomenon where hot dogs tend to be sold in packs of 8 and buns tend to be sold in packs of 6 or 16 and 12, whatever it is. They're not one-to-one, and so it can be frustrating, but it's kind of a similar parallel that Jeff points out in the charging market, in that you need the vehicles to have charging out there, but you need to have the vehicles using the charging to build more. So the equivalent of the 8-pack in this sense is the EV infrastructure, because you have to build it out just ahead of that market so it gets used by the vehicles and the vehicles can be sold, and then once it's used, you have the funds to build more, and so on and so forth in this virtuous cycle of innovation and investment. What you don't want to do is build so much of it that's not used that it looks bad for the rest of the market. You want people to see it and see it being used, not see it and see it looking like a stranded asset. it's not necessarily which comes first. I think the answer is pretty clear. You need the charging. You can't build so much of it that it's unprofitable for long periods of time. You have to skate just ahead of the puck so that it gets used and you can reinvest the capital from what's utilized to build even more.
Isn't the problem, though, sometimes I see on Twitter and somebody will post, hey, just turned up at the Tesla supercharging station, only 4 cars in front of me, shouldn't have to wait too long. And I'm like, yeah, but for people who aren't hardcore EVers, right, the kind of people that are about to start over the next couple of years buying electric cars, mum and dad in suburbia, the idea of waiting to charge, that's no longer fun because they get to hang out with fellow early adopter geeks. That's a nightmare. Like, oh, hang on, when you start to work out how many charger points and all those kind of things, do you have to do like market studies and work out, is this a 2er, is this a 4er, is this an 8er? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's a really good point because we do not want to have queuing that disrupts the customer experience. EVgo is a very customer-centric company, and we want to make sure it is that positive experience because you're right, that leading and bleeding edge is willing to accept a lot more pain than the regular mainstream adopter. So one thing is just, in the early days of this market, we and a lot of other companies put out single charger stations because in a market where there were only 2 or 3 EV owners, that was fine. But we all have to be done with those single charger stations because now 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10 is a lot more valuable, not only from spreading over the cost for the company, but also for those customers. A lot of it is, again, as a utilization-driven company, we're constantly looking at what we see in the market, and so we have a lot of good comps out there from having what we call not just a first mover's advantage, but a first learner's advantage. Because we've been doing this for 8 years, we can look at markets that we've been in for a while and see when does it start to go from low utilization to just above low to, oh my God, it's coming soon. The other thing is working closely with our partners. Again, I mentioned the strong relationships that EVgo has had with Nissan and BMW. That allows us some insight into where they want to go, and we can plan together. So if we know that they're putting a big push in a specific market or that they've seen pain points from their customer feedback in addition to our data, we can look at that and say, hey, we need to really start cranking up more here. We're about to finish a big project in the northeast of the United States along a very major interstate, the I-95 corridor. So you can get, from DC to up to Boston, for example. And we did that in partnership with Nissan with a bigger footprint and the ability for those stations to go to higher power levels in the future because they wanted to make sure that their East Coast presence is as good as their West Coast presence. And that was a really important partnership for us, and we will continue to be doing things like that. Part of my job is to work with the rest of our leadership and say, okay, what are we seeing in the broader trends? How do we know we need to start moving ahead in specific cities and regions to make sure that our customers aren't feeling that pain? Right now, we're doing a lot of investment and activity in Southern California because the curve has happened even more quickly than we expected, and we are starting to see a few stations with very, very high utilization in a way that we want to make sure that it doesn't upset too many customers, and so we want to get more infrastructure out there for them.
Now, apologies that I'm the other side of the world to you, so I'm not massively familiar with actually using your service. Do you do the whole real-time thing so that people know what to expect when even if a charger is broken? I mean, there's nothing worse than when a charger is broken, but hey, all things break at some point. We all get the blue screen of death on our PCs. Do you help to kind of, the apps and all those kind of things, enable people to make decisions about where they're going to go to?
Yeah, so first of all, as an owner and operator of our stations, EVgo is very much committed to maximum uptime, and we have a 98% uptime rate, and we're constantly working to keep that as high and as close to 100% as possible. But the EVgo app does have real-time data to show you if a charger is in maintenance mode or is occupied. And so that's a really important factor, too, so that we can have information so that if I'm driving around in an electric vehicle in Los Angeles, I can say, hey, the charger I usually use, both of them are currently occupied. I'm going to go down the road to one that looks like it's not. And that is definitely a key part of the digital experience. And we're constantly investing in our software platform and in our technical capabilities because there's more and more to do on that customer-facing side to make this a better experience for everyone. We often talk here in the company at EVgo that we want to make charging not just something that's easy, we want to make it fun. So one of the things we've started to do is naming all of our chargers, and by that I mean with people's names. So you could go find Martyn and go visit him on a road trip if you wanted to, but more importantly, we did that so it's a lot easier. When you pull up the EVgo app, you can say, Martyn is in use. I'm going to go look over at Natasha because she's down the block and she's not there. And if you get there and there are 4 chargers, you can look easily and say, okay, that one is Nancy, that one is Rob. That's the one that's occupied on the app. I know which one to just connect and swipe for.
Okay, final question. I want to be super respectful of your time, and you've been very generous to talk to the listeners today about EVgo. If we stare into Jonathan Levy's 5-year crystal ball, and this isn't meant to kind of trip anybody up because it's almost impossible to know exactly where we'll be in 5 years' time, but what would you hope that the EV market and EVgo would look like in, say, 2022?
Yeah, so it's a great question because everybody's crystal ball is foggy, but we're always trying to get there and peer through it. So EVgo already today is that public fast charging leader in the U.S. I would hope that in 5 years we still are, but at the same time we recognize that a rising tide is going to lift all these boats and there's a lot of investment needed. So I would imagine that there will be more market participants that we'll be collaborating with and competing against. But the really big takeaway will be that in 2022 it will be a U.S. market across the country where EV ownership has started to take over as the majority of new purchases. 2022 might be a little aggressive on that, but that's optimistic and hopeful because we are seeing these massive investments from automakers that make model availability look better and better. So my crystal ball says that we're seeing great utilization. We're able to keep reinvesting and build more and more. Fast charging has gotten faster, but has gotten faster in a way that isn't just indiscriminate, but rather catered to the customers in a way of what they need, and that we're seeing this massive increase in ridership from transportation networking companies on the path to autonomous vehicles, and electrification is critical for that.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for everything that you've said today. I think we've learned a lot and had a lot of fun, and it'd be good to check in maybe in a year's time and see where things are and update things a little bit. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Martyn. I appreciate it, and obviously when you're catering to EV lovers, I hope your audience grows as well.
And once again, a very big thank you to Jonathan from EVgo to talking to us on the podcast and having a fascinating chat about the current and future challenges to do with EV charging. I do want to say a heartfelt thank you to him and to the 62 patrons of this podcast whose generosity means you get to hear this show, and you can find out more at patreon.com/EVnewsdaily. Thank you to those supporting at $10 or more level. Every Saturday they get a bonus news episode, which is online right now. Thank you to Phil Roberts and Caesar Trujillo. Hi to David Allen, Sasha Pallenberg, Damien, Louis Hopkin, Ashley Hill, Bjard Fuchstack, Chris Benson, David Prescott, John Bailey, John H. Mayer, John Timmis, Marcel Lohman, Matthew Ellis, Neil E. Roberts, Paul Seeger-Smith, Philippe Calvé, Rod James and Scott Callahan. You can listen to 214 previous episodes of this show for free on all the usual podcast platforms, plus the audio on YouTube and evnewsdaily.com. If you subscribe, get them first and free and automatically. Have a wonderful day. I'll catch you tomorrow.